My Govanen! Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video we are finally getting to my review of the Rankin Bass The Hobbit, which, for my money, is one of the best adaptations of Tolkien's works out there in video format. And we'll get to that in a minute, but before I get to that, I did want to say a couple things. First of all, pardon the hair. This is my coronavirus cut. It's been probably at least 6 weeks since I've been able to get a haircut, and it's getting a little long and unruly. Not my fault, not much I can do about it, unfortunately. Second thing is, I do have a new Patreon subscriber who needs a shout out, and that is The Beech, B-E-E-C-H, like the tree, not like what you'd find on a coastline. Thank you very much for the support, The Beech, and if anybody else wants to do that, you can of course find my Patreon link in the description below, and I'll have it at the end of the video. That said, let's take a look at the Rankin Bass version of The Hobbit. So first things first, the Hobbit movie is actually pretty short, and by that I mean like roughly 75 minutes long. This is, I think, the shortest video adaptation of any of Tolkien's stories, and so you would think it would leave out a ton of material. And of course it does leave out a few very significant things. For one thing, there is no reference to an Arkenstone, there is no character of Beorn in the story, and some of the other parts of the story get kind of either cut down or short shrifted. For example, Bilbo only goes into Smaug's lair once. Now, that's not necessarily saying much, because even in Peter Jackson's sprawling, overly labored version, which has 3 whole movies dedicated to it, Bilbo only goes in once. Somehow the novel manages twice and doesn't spend nearly as much time. That said, the Rankin Bass version also only has him go in once, unlike in the actual novel. And there's other aspects to this as well. So, I mean, because there's no Arkenstone, Bilbo doesn't leave the mountain to go visit the Elf King and Bard and try to negotiate with them with the Arkenstone in an attempt to avoid the conflict that's inevitably coming. There are major parts of the story that get left out. But shockingly, despite some of these plot points that get left out entirely, the basic story is all there. And that includes Bilbo's own story arc. I mean, the aspect of the Arkenstone that he tries to use as a negotiation tool, that is a big part of his story arc, and I think it is kind of sad that that's left out. But in comparison to, say, Peter Jackson's movie, where I never felt like Bilbo had his growth from grocer to burglar, you might say, where he really kind of becomes the hero and leader of the group, here you actually get that. I think you do see Bilbo growing, although there's a certain extent to which Bilbo in this movie is never quite as grosser as maybe he might seem in the novel, but he's certainly not a hero starting out, and he definitely becomes one. And one of my favorite points of comparison for this is the scene with the spiders, because in Peter Jackson's movie, Bilbo does end up killing a spider, but the impression you get is basically the only reason he does it is because he's in a ring-induced fit of, I have to have the ring, and the spider's like getting in his way. In the movie that Rankin Bass put out, on the other hand, he definitely does step up and is, you know, the hero, putting himself forward at risk, even though he is invisible, of course, killing the spiders while the dwarves get to run away. So, I mean, there's a lot more of the real heart of the story, as well as most of the key moments of the story in Rankin Bass compared to the Peter Jackson version, in my opinion. One other thing that I should point out too, speaking of spiders, and this is another area where they kind of short-shrifted parts of the story. In the Rankin Bass version, Bilbo says to the dwarves when he's about to fight the spiders, make for the Wood Elves clearing, which we've got no reference to the Wood Elves prior to that. And then he tells them, he narrates later on and basically says the elves returned armed for battle. And again, we'd had no prior reference to the elves, so you wonder if an earlier part that referenced the elves got cut from the movie, or somebody just wasn't really thinking and slapped that in without realizing that there wasn't a prior reference to the elves, because nobody, two different people working on the project were tasked with two different sections of the book or something. But it's like, if you watch it and you don't have any context for that, you're like, what are you talking about, Bilbo? So there are definitely some weirdnesses that occur because of that, taking things out and really condensing the plot. Now let's look at some more hyper-specific things about this, both good and bad, and see what we think about it. First, I want to talk about music, and I've already done my review of the Rankin Bass version of The Return of the King, and I'll link to that in the description below if you're interested. And in that one, I also said that I like the music, but in this particular movie, I not only like the music, I think they did a phenomenal job of incorporating the actual songs from The Hobbit into the movie. And one of the interesting things that you'll note if you pay attention and you've read the novel is that every song in The Hobbit but one is actually straight from the book. The only one that's not straight out of the book is the opening, um, the theme song, you might call it, the one that's actually sung by Glenn Yarbrough of the epic warble. See my Return of the King review for that. Where, the greatest adventure is what lies ahead. That is the only song in the entire movie that is not straight out of the book. And the ones that they do take straight out of the book are really well done. I think they mostly hit exactly the right key in terms of like what the song is kind of supposed to convey. And it's also really interesting too that some of the tunes get reused. So for instance, the Down in the Valley song, that tune gets reused, although in, I think, a minor key, at the point where the armies are about to meet and fight each other, where it's singing about the dragon is withered, his bones are now crumbled. That is also a song that comes in later in the book, but in the book it's sung by the elves when Bilbo returns to Rivendell, and so it makes sense that they use that same tune. They're just using it in a slightly different context in the movie. Similarly, the dwarves' song from the very beginning, where they're singing about their desire to recover their long-forgotten gold, that tune, with no lyrics, is also reused later on when Bilbo is confronting Smaug in his lair, and you can see why, because that desire for gold and things is very much a big deal at that point in the story, and of course, that tension between Bilbo and Smaug is very much based on that exact type of thing, the dragon greed and all of that. So it really kind of makes sense to see that tune reused there because it all has to do with this gold. So that's a really cool thing, I thought. Now, I've already mentioned a couple of things within this song context that bring up pronunciation, because I've been saying Smaug, of course, which is more consistent with Peter Jackson's version. I'm sure more consistent with what Tolkien intended, although Tolkien didn't put a pronunciation guide in The Hobbit. He did in The Lord of the Rings, and based on that, it should be Smaug. I, of course, grew up saying Smaug because this movie pronounces it Smaug. And there are many other instances of bad pronunciation in the movie as well. Most of them are pretty easy to overlook, and many of them are not even that bad. I mean, especially compared to the Rankin Bass Return of the King, The Hobbit is virtually a paragon of correct pronunciation. But there are definitely points where he says, characters say names or things, and you're like, that's not quite right. So, if you're really a stickler for pronunciation, you will be annoyed at certain points. I am kind of, but because I grew up with it, I just kind of overlook it too. So that's pronunciation. Let's look at a few other things. Okay, so here's a few minor points that are not really a major impact, but definitely are a little interesting. For one thing, you can tell that this movie is made for kids, which makes sense. I mean, it's Rankin Bass animated Hobbit. And one of the ways that you can tell that is when any kind of killing actually happens, most of the time you get this weird kaleidoscope effect. And you can see this with the Great Goblin and with the spiders. And here's an example of the Great Goblin getting killed by Gandalf.
I know that sword! It is called Glampring! The full hammer! Now!
So this kind of makes it so that we don't actually see the violence, and therefore it makes it a little more kid-friendly. Some of the violence you do get to see a little more without this, like in the Battle of the Five Armies. You get to see orcs get killed, although you really don't see anything happening. You see people swing swords and goblins kind of, but you don't actually really see much in the way of contact, and there's certainly no gore like in the Ralph Bakshi version of the Lord of the Rings. So you can definitely tell they kind of toned things down for the kids there. Another interesting point is the Wood Elves. This this may be the one major caveat to what I said earlier about this being the best adaptation of Tolkien's stories in video format. What the heck is up with the Wood Elves, people? We've got these... We've already seen Elrond, right? Elrond has a beard, which doesn't really make much sense, but I can overlook that. But Elf King in Mirkwood has this crazy, like, East European accent and looks hideous. He is nothing like an elf. He looks more like a garden gnome or something out of... I don't even know, like, what this was supposed to be. The Wood Elves don't look like elves at all. They really just don't. And you know, growing up watching The Hobbit, I didn't know any better, but, you know, once you realize what elves are supposed to be like, and you see it again, you're like, wow, where did they get that idea? So that's possibly the biggest mark against this movie, is just the weird way that they handled the Wood Elves. Another minor point is, after the Battle of Five Armies is over, and Bilbo is talking to Gandalf, Gandalf says that of the original 13, there are only 7 dwarves left. And soon it will be only 6 because Thorin is about to die. This is way out of line with the actual story, and here's where one area where Peter Jackson got it right. The only dwarves of the original 13 who die are Thorin, Fili, and Kili. And it's really not clear to me why you would do that. I mean, it's, you know, sad, of course, that Thorin and Fili and Kili die, and Thorin is the only one whose death we really pay much attention to in the movie, and so it's like, why did you need to add another 4 dwarves on top of that? You know, I mean, if you want to keep this kid friendly, the fewer deaths it would seem, the better, but he's just unnecessarily piling on 4 more dwarves who died in the Battle of Five Armies, and it's like, what'd you bother for? What's the point? So that was kind of weird. And then, of course, a final point is the way that the ring is handled. Now, this is something that is kind of, both Peter Jackson and Rankin Bass handle this in a weird way. Peter Jackson, I think, handles it downright badly, because he basically makes the ring as potent in The Hobbit as he does in The Lord of the Rings, and basically turns The Hobbit into another Lord of the Rings almost, in a way. In the Rankin Bass, that's not so much the problem, but the problem is that Gandalf intimates that he knows what the ring is. When Bilbo first grabs it and comes out and meets the dwarves again, and he tells his story, which leaves out the ring, Gandalf says that, you know, his story has the ring of truth, and it rings true, and he gives Bilbo a knowing look and shuts him up before he says anything in response. So we get the idea that he knows he has a ring at this point, which is enough. that you could kind of overlook almost, because Gandalf does say in the Lord of the Rings eventually that he knows that Bilbo had the ring from way earlier, because he knew his original story was nuts when he finally told him the story. And then when Bilbo finally told him the real story of Gollum, he recognized also that there's no way that it happened. Well, when he tells him his original story of Gollum, that Gollum gave it to him as a birthday present, he realizes that that's nuts. But then later, almost at the end of the movie, he brings up the topic of the ring again. Like, what are you going to do with the ring, Bilbo? And he says, I'll keep it on the mantelpiece. And he says that, my adventures come to an end. And then Gandalf goes into this thing where he's talking about, well, if you only understood that ring, you would know that it's only beginning. Which implies that Gandalf knows exactly which ring it is, which is super problematic, because now it's like, okay, so we know that this is the one ring as late as when Bilbo ends his adventure in The Hobbit, and yet we're going to wait 60 years before anybody does anything about it. That's just a little, and I mean, you can tell what they're doing, right? You know that they're trying to set up for the sequel of The Lord of the Rings. But at the same time, it's like, you just completely ruined any ability to make Gandalf look like a smart planner in any of this, because now Gandalf is like, yeah, I know where the One Ring is, and it's just going to sit there for 60 years while I could totally be doing something about it. So that's kind of like, that hurts my brain. But those are really kind of the worst points to me about the movie. The elves in the ring, those are the biggest problems, I think. Now let's talk about my overall thoughts. So, what do I think about this movie? Definitely get this movie. As I already said, this is one of the best film adaptations of Tolkien's works there is. It is short, but it's, like I said, the music really hits all the right notes pretty much. No pun intended. The story pretty much contains the essence of the story from the book. It leaves out a lot of detail, but when you really think about it, a lot of The Hobbit is written in terms of giving descriptions and talking about Bilbo's internal monologue. There's not really much plot left out of this movie, except, like I said, you got Beorn left out, and you got the Arkenstone left out, and anything connected to that. But other than that, the plot is all pretty much there, which is ironically better than what you can say for some longer adaptations of Tolkien's works. So, you cover most of the ground. It has really, I think, the heart of the story better than any other adaptation as well. I think the closest any other adaptation comes to really capturing the heart of the story, maybe Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, and maybe Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring. I wouldn't say that for the Two Towers and Return of the King, but the Fellowship, I think, does a really good job. Ralph Bakshi does a really good job, although he has to cut a ton of material. He does a good job despite cutting all that material. But I think this particular movie is the one that really, of all the film adaptations I know, really captures the heart of the story and most of the plot of the story. If you don't like 70s music, you may not like the music, but I just urge you, if you've never seen it before and you're not sure about the music, really think about it in terms of how they're using the songs from the book and how they're incorporating them and actually giving music to them that really fits what the songs are doing in the book itself. Really pay attention to that, because I think it's really, really spot on. I think that really adds a lot to it, because if you read The Hobbit and you get all the songs and you don't skip over them, and then you see this movie, you're going to recognize, yes, this is the story I remember reading. So those are, you've got a few bad points, like I mentioned, the whole thing about Gandalf knowing what the ring is and the Wood Elves being like, what are those? But by and large, this movie is almost a perfect adaptation of a Tolkien story, which is really, really, really impressive when you think about it, considering they only had about 75 minutes. So this is definitely, if you do not have this movie and you have never seen it, find a way to watch it. Even if you don't buy it, definitely find a way to watch it. You will enjoy it, I would almost guarantee. So that is my plug for the Rankin Bass Hobbit. So hope you enjoyed that video. Hope you now want to go out and watch that movie either for the first time or watch it again if you're like me and grew up watching it. If you did enjoy the video, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. You can, of course, follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore, and I occasionally drop some Tolkien trivia questions there, some really tough ones sometimes. If you want to subscribe to the channel, you can do that here, and if you want to support the channel, you can do it here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.